In 1919, a German officer wrote one sentence about American soldiers that his own army would spend the next 25 years failing to understand. He wrote that they were a mob, pure and simple. He was not insulting them. He was a professional soldier filing a professional report, and he was writing down exactly what he saw with the flat precision of a man filling out a form. And then he added one more line almost as an afterthought, and that line is the reason we are here. He wrote that in the American lines, he could not tell the officers from the men if your father wore that uniform or your uncle or your grandfather. Then what follows is about the thing they carried into that war without knowing they were carrying it. No army had ever tried to use it. Nobody planned it. It was not in any manual. It is the reason the man writing that report never understood what he was looking at. 25 years later, on a June morning in France, the strongest armored divisions in Europe would sit still for most of a day, while American soldiers who had lost their units, lost their maps, and lost their officers were already moving. The war had been over 4 months. In an office building in Chaumont, France, a group of American intelligence officers sat surrounded by paper, and they were not planning attacks. They were reading mail, captured letters, interrogation transcripts, diaries taken off the bodies of German soldiers, reports written by German officers to their superiors, never meant for any American to see. Thousands of pages of it, in cramped German handwriting, hauled in crates from the front and stacked on desks in a country that was slowly learning how to be at peace again. They were looking for something specific. They wanted to know what the Germans had thought of them, not what the Germans said in public, not the propaganda, not the surrender terms or the diplomatic language of Versailles. They wanted the private assessment, the thing one German officer wrote to another when he assumed no American would ever read it. What they compiled ran to 84 pages. They gave it a plain, bureaucratic title, Candid Comment on the American Soldier of 1917 to 1918, and Kindred Topics by the Germans. It has never been famous. It sits in the archives, cited occasionally by military historians, unknown to almost everyone else. And it contains one of the strangest confessions in the history of modern warfare, a document in which the losing side describes in careful detail the thing they could not understand about the men who beat them. They did not write about American artillery. They did not write about American industry, though they understood it perfectly well. They wrote about the way American soldiers behaved. That is where the sentence comes from. The mob line, it sits near the front of the report in a section on discipline, alongside notes on how the Americans carried themselves. Slouchy was the word, careless in the shoulders, wrong in the posture. And then the line about the officers. Read it again, slowly, and notice what it is not. He is not describing a tactical weakness. He is not talking about firepower or formations or the quality of American marksmanship. He is describing something he can't not name, a visual detail, a matter of bearing and posture, and the distance between one man and another. In his army, you could tell an officer at 200 meters the uniform was different. The bearing was different. The space around him was different. Men moved aside, straightened, went quiet. In the American lines, he looked for that space, and it was not there. Another German observer in the same report went further. He described the way American officers spoke to their enlisted men, and he compared it to his own army. And the comparison came out in a sentence that reads today like an accident, like a man who has told the truth about himself without meaning to. He wrote that American officers treated their men very differently than in the German army, in which officers had always treated their men as cattle. That is a German officer, writing in German for German readers. In 1919, nobody made him say that. And then there is the passage that the American compilers seem to have found irresistible because of what it reveals about the men doing the observing. A German soldier described a group of 14 American prisoners brought in one day. Standard procedure. Names, units, numbers. The prisoners refuse to talk. That happens. Then they refuse to work. That happens too. Then they talk back to the officers. And the German writing the count noted two reactions in the room. The officers were annoyed. The other German soldiers were delighted. He describes it as a concealed delight, a thing you could see on the faces of the enlisted men who were watching, and which none of them dared to show openly. Somewhere in that room stood a German private who had been in uniform for 2 years, or 3 or 4, who had been screamed at on a parade ground until the screaming stopped meaning anything, who had loaded and fired and marched and dug and buried friends, and who watched an American, a prisoner, a defeated man, a man with nothing, say no to an officer, and felt something move in his chest that he had to keep off his face. That is the whole story, right there in one sentence, in a report almost nobody has read. To understand why that moment mattered, why a German private's concealed delight in 1919 points forward to what happened in Normandy 25 years later, you have to go back much further than the Great War. You have to go back to a battlefield in Saxony in 1757 and to a king who was furious in the middle of a victory. The Battle of Rossbach was fought on the 5th of November, 1757. Frederick II of Prussia, Frederick the Great, 45 years old, a man who wrote poetry in French and played the flute and was arguably the finest field commander in Europe, faced a combined French and Imperial army roughly twice the size of his own. He destroyed it in about 90 minutes. It was one of the most lopsided victories of the 18th century. It made his reputation permanent. It is still studied. And Frederick was not satisfied. Because during the fighting there had been moments and openings, moops, gaps, the kind of chances that appear for a few minutes and then close forever, where a regimental commander with nerve could have turned a victory into an annihilation. And his commanders had waited. They had seen the opening. They had looked over their shoulders. They had waited for instructions from above. And by the time the instructions came, the moment was gone. Frederick returned to this complaint again and again across his military writings for the rest of his life. His officers treated orders as sacred text. They executed the letter of the instruction rather than pursuing the purpose behind it. They would not act unless told precisely what to do. Hold that thought, because this is the founding paradox of the entire story. The greatest soldier Prussia ever produced looked at the machine he had built in the middle of one of his greatest triumphs and saw the flaw. And then 3 generations of Prussian and German military culture went ahead and built the machine anyway. Bigger, tighter, more perfect. Now, and this matters, because the easy version of this story is a lie. The machine worked. It worked extraordinarily well. There is a comfortable narrative in which German obedience was simply a weakness, a robotic failing, and the Allies won because free men naturally beat unfree men. That narrative is false, and the people who lived through 1940 knew it was false. The Prussian system was built for a reason. In the age of the musket, when battles were decided by lines of men standing upright in the open, reloading under fire, an army's effectiveness depended on formations that moved as one body. A soldier who paused to think, who hesitated, who stepped out of line, that man was not showing initiative. He was a hole in the wall, so the system trained the hesitation out of them, not out of the officers. Officer training in the German tradition was some of the most sophisticated in the world, running years long, rotating men through infantry school and weapons staff assignments, deliberately teaching a lieutenant to think like a battalion commander. But the common soldier, the rifleman in the ranks, his job was to load, aim, fire, advance, and if necessary, die on schedule. And they built the institutions to make it permanent. Basic training in the German army in the years before the Second World War was 16 weeks, and it was saturated with drill, parade movements, close order marching, the mechanical repetition of the body responding to a voice. Not because parade drill wins battles, because performed daily for months, it stops being a thing you do and becomes a thing you are. And when the war came, the results were terrifying. Poland fell in weeks. And then, in the spring of 1940, the German army did something that people had believed was no longer possible. France had spent 20 years and an enormous portion of its national treasure building the Maginot Line and the doctrine behind it. The French army was widely considered the finest in Europe. The British Expeditionary Force was in the field alongside it. Belgium, the Netherlands, millions of men, layered defenses, a defensive system designed by the survivors of Verdun who understood exactly what modern war cost. 6 weeks. The whole thing came apart in 6 weeks. Not because German soldiers were braver, but because German units executed complex operations faster than their opponents could produce decisions. The tempo was the weapon. Obedience made the tempo possible. After that, German intelligence turned its attention west across the Atlantic and made an assessment about the Americans. They knew the numbers. They knew about American factories, American steel, American oil. Nobody in Berlin was confused about American industrial capacity. What they doubted was whether any of it could be turned into soldiers. The assessment that circulated in the German officer corps was that the Americans would arrive with enormous quantities of everything except the ability to fight. They would provide the mass, they would not provide the skill. Britain would still have to do the soldiering, and on the evidence available in 1940, that assessment was not stupid. Here is the number that explains why. In 1940, the United States Army, the entire regular army of the United States of America, stood at roughly 174,000 men, not divisions, men. By the standard reckonings of the period, that placed the American army somewhere around 17th in the world, behind Romania, behind Belgium, comparable in size to the army of Portugal. The German army was measured in millions.
The Wehrmacht had veteran formations that had been fighting continuously since 1939, commanded by officers who had been fighting since 1914.
The Americans had a small professional cadre, a great deal of ceremonial or tradition, cavalry officers who still thought about horses, and almost no experience of modern mechanized combat by anyone below the very top. So when a German staff officer read the intelligence summaries in 1940 and 1941 and concluded that the United States was not a serious military power, he was not being arrogant. He was reading the table correctly. What he could not read, because there was no column for it, was what about to walk through the doors of the recruiting stations. Between 1941 and 1945, roughly 16 million Americans served in uniform, 16 million, and the overwhelming majority of them had never worn a uniform in their lives before Pearl Harbor. They were not soldiers. They were a cross-section of a country, a truck driver from Indiana, a hardware clerk from Ohio, a high school teacher in Iowa, who had spent the last 6 years explaining the causes of the last war to teenagers who were now being drafted to this one. Farm boys from Kansas who had never seen the ocean. Machinists from Detroit, kids from Texas who had been in college for 8 months. They came in carrying something that no army had ever seriously tried to use. Not courage. The Germans had courage. The Russians had courage. Courage is the most common thing on a battlefield and the least decisive. They came in carrying a set of habits, the habits of people who had grown up arguing, who negotiated with their bosses, who complained about their landlords, who voted and disagreed loudly with their neighbors about how they voted and expected, as a baseline, unexamined assumption about the nature of reality, that if someone told them to do something stupid, they were entitled to say so. The United States Army spent the first 2 years of the war finding this out the hard way. The Army hired a sociologist named Samuel Stauffer, and Stauffer's teams surveyed something on the order of 500,000 soldiers across the course of the war. The results filled volumes, and a great deal of it was the Army discovering that it did not understand the men it had drafted. Soldiers who described themselves as civilians temporarily in uniform, men who resented the caste structure, the ceremony, the traditions of separation between officer and enlisted, man that every European army took as the natural order of things. Men who, and this drove the professionals to distraction, right? Wanted to know why. And the complaint that came back again and again in those surveys was not about the food or the mud. It was a question. These men had been raised in a country built on the assumption that a citizen gets to ask why. They wanted to know how anyone expected a few months of training to undo 18 years of that. They were not being defiant. They were asking something real. And the answer, which the American Army did not know yet, and would learn only through a series of humiliations that cost thousands of lives, was that you don't erase it. You cannot erase it. 16 weeks of drill will not undo 18 years of a boy talking back at his own dinner table. But that answer took years to arrive, and it arrived late, and it arrived through blood. Because here's the part of this story that the flattering version leaves out. Those democratic habits did not make good soldiers automatically. They made almost the opposite at first. An army needs cohesion. It needs men to move together under conditions specifically designed to make moving together impossible. The European solution to that problem was 200 years old, and it worked. Build the hierarchy, make it absolute, drill it until it is reflex. The American Army in 1941 and 1942 had a hierarchy on paper and almost nothing underneath it. It had 21-year-old lieutenants with brand new bars on their shoulders, walking into platoons of men who were older than they were, who had held real jobs, who had spent their entire adult lives in workplaces where authority had to be earned and where a man who demanded respect purely because of his title was regarded as a fool. And the Army had no doctrine for that. No manual explained how a young officer walks into a room full of skeptical grown men and becomes someone they will follow into machine gun fire. There was rank. Rank was supposed to be enough. Rank was not enough. So for most of 1942 and into 1943, the American Army improvised. It made it up as it went. It promoted men and hoped. It sent units into combat that had never trained together. It put commanders in charge of formations they did not understand. And the results were what you would expect. Two things were true at the same time, and the tension between them is where this entire story lives. The German Army had built, over 3 centuries, a system that produced the most tactically efficient soldiers in the world, and that system had a ceiling written into its design. Because a system built on obedience is only ever as good as the man being obeyed. It executes brilliant decisions brilliantly and catastrophic decisions catastrophically, and it has no mechanism anywhere in its structure for telling the difference. And on the 2nd of August, 1934, that ceiling came down permanently. President Hindenburg died. Within hours, the offices of Chancellor and President were merged, and every soldier in the German armed forces was required to swear a new oath, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, not to the state, to a man. The oath committed them, by God and by their sacred word, to render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. Unconditional. 300 years of Prussian discipline. 16 weeks of drill hammered into the bones of every recruit. An officer corps of unmatched professional education. And all of it, every part of it, wired to a single point of failure. Nobody in that ceremony asked the question that mattered. Nobody asked what the machine does when the orders are wrong. They would find out in Normandy on a June morning in 1944 when the strongest armored reserves in the West sat motionless in the French countryside for hours while the invasion came ashore. Because the officers on the spot who knew exactly what had to be done did not have the authority to order it, and the authority sat hundreds of miles away. But before Normandy, there was North Africa. Before the Americans learned anything, they had to be broken first. In February of 1943, in a pass in the mountains of central Tunisia, the United States Army walked into the worst defeat it would suffer in the European theater. Roughly 6,000 casualties, a great many of them taken prisoner, hundreds of tanks and guns, an entire corps driven back 50 miles in 5 days by an enemy commanded by a man who had been beating better armies than theirs for 3 years. The German assessment afterward was clinical. The Americans, they wrote, attacked in parade ground formations. Their armor advanced without infantry. Their reconnaissance was inadequate. Their command was invisible. And every one of those observations was correct. But there is something else in the record from Kasserine Pass. something that does not appear in the German after-action reports because the Germans had no way to see it and no framework to recognize it if they had. The American sergeants knew, the junior officers knew, the men on the ground could see the approach roads were wrong, could see the positions were badly sighted, could see that the timing made no sense. They knew the plan was going to kill them. And there was no way, not one channel, not one mechanism, not one procedure in the entire United States Army in February of 1943 for that knowledge to travel upward to the man who could do something about it. The commander of the American Second Corps was a 59-year-old Major General named Lloyd Fredendall. He was running the battle from a headquarters roughly 70 miles behind the front line. He almost never went forward to see it. 70 miles. Sit with that number for a moment. 70 miles is the distance from Philadelphia to Baltimore. It is a long drive on a good road. In February of 1943 in Tunisia, on tracks that were mud in the morning and dust by afternoon, it was most of a day. That was the distance between the man commanding the American Second Corps and the men he was commanding. Lloyd Fredendall was 59 years old. He had spent his life in the Army. He had been marked as capable. He had impressed the right people. He had done well in the peacetime service. And when the war came, he was given a corps. On paper, that was a reasonable decision made by reasonable men. He built his headquarters in a ravine near Tebessa. Not a tent, not a farmhouse, a ravine in the rock dug in by engineers who could have been building airfields. 200 men working on shelters for a headquarters that no German aircraft had ever come close to. And from that ravine, he issued orders in a private code of his own invention. Not a cipher for security. A personal shorthand, his own way of describing terrain and unitions invented by him, understood fully by nobody. His own staff officers spent hours trying to work out what he meant. Division commanders received instructions and had to guess. There is a phrase in one of his messages that has survived, an instruction to move a unit to a location described by reference to a walking boy and a hunting ground. Officers with lives in their hands sat over that paper, trying to determine which hill he was talking about. Meanwhile, 110 miles east, Erwin Rommel was doing what Rommel did. On the 14th of February, German armor came through Fayed Pass before dawn. What followed was not a battle in the way most people picture one. It was a collapse. American units that had never fought were hit by units that had been fighting since 1940. American tanks advanced without infantry alongside them, exactly the way the training manuals had shown. Exactly the way the manuals were wrong. Men in fresh uniforms went forward in formations that would have looked correct on a training field back home and were slaughtered by veterans who had unlearned all of that in the desert 2 years earlier. In 5 days, the Americans were driven back roughly 50 miles. Around 6,000 were killed, wounded, or had away into captivity. Hundreds of tanks, guns, and trucks were left scattered across Tunisia. And in the German reports afterward, there is a tone that stings worse than anger. It is not contempt. It is professional disappointment. The Americans, they noted, had good equipment and did not know how to use it. Their coordination was poor. Their reconnaissance was poor. They fought bravely and were not soldiers yet. Now here is the first thing that almost every account of Kasserine gets wrong. The men were not the problem. Go down into the record, the after-action interviews, the letters, the accounts collected later, and something comes up again and again from the sergeants and the young lieutenants who were actually out there. They knew. They looked at the approach roads and saw a channel. They looked at the gun positions and saw fields of fire that covered nothing. They looked at the dispositions, units strung out, mutually unsupporting, scattered across ground nobody had walked, and they understood in their stomachs before the first shell landed that this was going to kill them. They were right. They were completely, verifiably right. And there was no way on God's earth for that knowledge to reach the ravine. Not because anyone forbade it, because nothing existed to carry it. No procedure, no expectation, no habit, no moment in the day when a corps commander asked a staff sergeant what he had seen. Oh, think about that as a system, not as a story. Somewhere in the American line in Tunisia, there was a 30-year-old sergeant who had been a foreman in a machine shop in Ohio. A man who had spent 10 years of his life spotting a bad plan before it wasted a week's work, and who could see this one going wrong in front of him. And his knowledge had nowhere to go. That is the real lesson of Kasserine Pass. Not that Americans were cowards. Oh. They were not, and the men who died there deserved better than that lie. The failure was structural. The Army had drafted a nation full of men who had opinions and had built no plumbing to carry them upward. Fredendall was relieved on the 6th of March, 1943. His replacement drove into Second Corps headquarters that morning with a column of scout cars and sirens. George Patton was 57 years old. Everything about the theater of him is famous, and most obscures what he actually did in the 17 days he had before the Germans came again. He did not deliver a speech and transform an army. That is a movie. What he did was leave the building. He went forward. He drove to the units. He walked ground his predecessor had barely looked at. He stood in the positions and looked at the same approach roads the sergeants had been looking at. He talked to battalion commanders, company commanders, and this is the part that would have baffled a German corps commander. He talked to sergeants. In the German system, a general does not gather intelligence from a Feldwebel. The chain runs downward with the impersonal efficiency of a telegram. Information flows up through prescribed channels, filtered and formalized at each level, arriving at the top as a summary. Patton went and asked the men who had been shot at, and what he found was an army that had already been arguing with itself for weeks, in holes and truck cabs and mess lines. Sergeants and lieutenants and privates going over what had happened and why, disagreeing, working it out, reaching conclusions that no one above them had asked for. To the German officer who wrote that 1919 report, that arguing would have looked like exactly what he called it: a mob in discipline, men without a proper relationship to authority. Patton looked at it and saw a report nobody had written down. 17 days later, on the 23rd of March, 1943, the 10th Panzer Division attacked down a valley near El Guettar, expecting to find the same corps they had broken 6 weeks earlier. They found a killing ground. Tank destroyers dug in on the valley walls where the German gunners could not see them. Artillery pre-registered on every approach. A minefield in the throat of the valley that stopped the lead tanks in the first minutes and packed the ones behind them into a mass with nowhere to turn. and then guns from 3 directions at once, so that no German commander in that valley could work out where the fire was coming from. The 10th Panzer lost more than 30 tanks in a single engagement. But here is where this story has to be honest with you, and where most versions of it are not. Guettar was not won by a culture of open debate. Guettar was won by artillery, by terrain, by tank destroyers in good positions and gunners who had registered their targets in advance and mines laid where they mattered. It was won by professional stuff work and by the fact that the United States could put more shells on a valley floor than any army on earth. The argument, the listening, the friction, the sergeants who had been talking it through in the dark, that did not win the battle. It shortened the time it took to learn how to win the battle. That is the honest claim. It is a smaller claim than the one you usually hear, and it is the true one. An army that lets information travel upward corrects its mistakes in 17 days instead of 17 months. Over 4 years, that is worth more than any single victory. Which brings us to a hedgerow in Normandy 16 months later, and to a sergeant standing in front of a problem that was stopping an army group. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron was a New Jersey man. He had not gone to engineering school. He had no patents. The problem in front of him was the bocage. If you have never seen it, understand that the word hedgerow does not describe it. These were not garden hedges. They were earthen banks built up over centuries of Norman farming, banks of packed soil several feet thick, bound together by root systems old enough to stop a bulldozer, with hedge and scrub growing another dozen feet above that. Every field in that country was a walled box, and the Germans had had weeks to prepare them. A Sherman tank could not go through. So it went over, nosing up the bank, tilting back, and exposing its belly plate, the thinnest armor on the vehicle, to a German anti-tank team waiting 40 yards away in the next hedge. The First Army was advancing at roughly a mile a day and paying for every foot of it. And in a session where men were kicking ideas around, another soldier in the unit said something that most of the room did not take seriously. Why not put teeth on the front of the tank and cut through the bank instead of climbing over it? It was the kind of remark that usually dies an eye in the room it is spoken in. Cullen did not let it die. He went and found steel, and where he found it is the part that stays with you. He cut it out of the German beach obstacles, the steel the enemy had planted in the surf to stop the landing craft, hauled inland and now sitting in scrap piles. German steel meant to stop the Americans on the sand, welded onto American tanks to break the German line inland. On the 14th of July, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, 51 years old, came to watch a demonstration. A Sherman with a set of steel prongs bolted to its nose came across a field, hit the hedgerow, and went through it. Not over. Through, carrying a wall of dirt and roots ahead of it, coming out the other side with its belly still down and its gun still forward. Bradley ordered it built. In 11 days, around 500 were manufactured and fitted. By the time Operation Cobra opened, by most accounts, something like 3 in 5 of First Army's tanks carried one. Cobra broke open the German front in Normandy. Now, precisely why this could not have happened on the other side of the line. Not because German soldiers lacked imagination. German engineering in that war was extraordinary, and no serious person argues otherwise. It could not have happened because in a system built on order-based tactics, a sergeant with a welding torch does not put a solution in front of a lieutenant general 11 days after someone in the ranks thought of it. He submits it, it goes up, it is evaluated, it is staffed, and if it comes back at all, it comes back in months. The Americans did it in under 2 weeks because a man in the ranks was allowed to say something in a room full of men who outranked him, and because a sergeant took him seriously, and because a 3-star general was willing to stand in a field and watch. And now the part that costs. Because if you leave the story there, you have been told a comfortable lie. There is a body of statistical work associated most famously with the Trevor Dupuy and vigorously disputed by other historians ever since, arguing that German infantry inflicted casualties at a meaningfully higher rate than the Allied units they faced across the whole war, even in engagements where equipment was roughly comparable. The methodology is contested. Treat the exact figure with caution. But the underlying point survives the argument. Man for man, unit for unit, the German infantryman of that war was, on average, a more efficient killer than his American counterpart. The training system that produced him had been refined over decades. The small unit cohesion was real, and the American replacement system, by contrast, was something close to cruel. German divisions were pulled out of the line and rebuilt. American divisions in Europe often were not. A man who survived stayed, and stayed. There was no tour length, no rotation home, no end date. You fought until you were killed, until you were wounded badly enough to be evacuated, or until your mind gave out, which the Army recorded in its paperwork as a psychiatric casualty. That was the deal. Nobody told the men from Indiana and Ohio that when they signed. And then there is the Hurtgen Forest. From September of 1944 into February of 1945, in a stretch of dense pine woods along the German border no more than 50 square miles, American forces fought a battle that, by most estimates, caused something on the order of 33,000 casualties. The forest was so thick that armor could not maneuver and air support could not see the ground. German artillery burst its shells in the treetops so that the fragments came straight down on men lying flat. And lying flat did not help. And the men on the ground said so. They said the ground was wrong. They said the objectives did not justify what was being spent. Junior officers said it, sergeants said it, it went up the chain, and the attacks continued anyway. Regiment after regiment fed into those woods month after month in weather that froze the wounded where they fell. Understand what that means for everything you have just been told. This time the channel existed. The men used it. They said clearly and repeatedly that this was a slaughter for nothing, and it did not matter. And in that forest in the winter of 1944, a soldier from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron stepped on a mine and lost a leg. His name was Curtis Cullen. The man whose welding job broke open Normandy did not get a clean ending. He got the Hurtgen, like everyone else. Now go back 4 months to the 6th of June, 1944, and look at the other side of the line. Because everything this story has argued gets tested that morning, in the dark, on both sides at once. Start with the myth and then take it apart, because the true version is worse. The myth says the German armored reserves sat frozen on D-Day because Hitler was asleep and nobody dared wake him. It is a good line. It is not quite right. Here is what actually happened. The 21st Division was under Rommel's command in France, and it moved. It counterattacked that day, north of Caen, and reached the coast in one place before being forced back. Nobody had to wake anyone for that. The problem was the other two, the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzerlehr, the strongest armored formations in the West, the ones positioned specifically to throw an invasion back into the sea, were not Rommel's to release. They were held in reserve under the direct control of the High Command in Berlin, which meant they could not move without authorization from the top. And through the morning of the 6th of June, as reports came in from the beaches, as the scale of it became undeniable, senior German officers in France asked for those divisions and were told to wait. Hours went by. The request went up. Nothing came down. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, 52 years old, was not in France at all. He had driven home to Herrlingen in Germany. It was his wife, Lucy's birthday. He had judged the weather too poor for a landing, and he had been wrong. And by the time he got the call and started back, the beachhead was established. The release orders for those divisions finally came in the afternoon. By then, Allied aircraft owned every road in Normandy in daylight. Understand what you are looking at. This is not stupidity. Every one of those German commanders was a professional. Several of them knew exactly what needed to happen and said so. It is the ceiling, the one built into the design in 1934, when every soldier in that army swore unconditional obedience to one man. The machine executes the decisions made at the top with perfect fidelity. And when no decision comes down, the machine does nothing at all, no matter how many men inside it can see the war being lost in front of them. Now look at what the Americans were doing during those same hours. The airborne drop that night was, by any professional standard, a mess. Flak, cloud, and evasive flying scattered the 82nd and 101st across half of Normandy. Men landed miles from where they were supposed to be, alone in fields the Germans had flooded in the dark, with no idea where their units were. The plan had failed on contact, and the men on the ground did not wait for a new one. First, Lieutenant Richard Winters was 26 years old from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He landed near St. Mary-Église with no weapon but a knife. His leg bag, with his rifle in it, had torn away in the jump. He was not supposed to be commanding Easy Company. The commander was First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan, 23 years old, and Meehan's aircraft had been hit and gone into the ground with everyone aboard. Nobody knew that yet. Winters gathered what men he could find in the dark, some his, some strangers from other units, and moved toward the sound of the guns. At a place called Brecourt Manor, a German battery was shelling one of the exits from Utah Beach, where American infantry were coming ashore. By then, he had found a weapon. He had roughly a dozen men and no orders at all. He looked at the ground, worked out an approach through the hedgerows, and took the guns. There was no authorization. There was nobody to ask. There was a man with the best available information standing on the ground, and a system that expected him to decide. Multiply that by 1,000 small groups across Normandy that night, sergeants assembling men they had never met, privates linking up in ditches and going after whatever was in front of them. That is the whole difference, and it fits in one sentence. On the 6th of June, 1944, German officers who knew exactly what to do were waiting for permission. American officers who did not know where they were moving. 6 months later, at Bastogne, the two cultures met in a single piece of paper. The 101st Airborne was surrounded. On the 22nd of December, 1944, German officers came forward under a white flag with a written surrender demand, a formal document, courteous, invoking honorable terms and the wish to spare unnecessary bloodshed. It was written the way such things had been written for 200 years. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, 46 years old, was acting commander of the division. He read it. And here is where the legend needs correcting. Because the real version is better. McAuliffe was not being defiant. He was not composing a line for history. He read a demand for his surrender at a moment when he believed his men were doing fine, and he was irritated by the interruption. He said, "Nuts." Then he put it down and went back to what he had been doing. It was his staff who told him later, when a formal reply was needed, that he had already said the right thing. Someone pointed out it would be hard to beat, so they typed it. One word on a page. Colonel Joseph Harper, 43 years old, carried it out to the German officers, and they did not understand it. They asked what it meant. Harper told them it meant the same as go to hell. A German major walked away furious, not at the refusal, which he had expected, but at the informality. In his tradition, a formal ultimatum received a formal answer. That was the form. The form mattered. To the Americans, one word was not rudeness. It was clarity. And now the last thing, the thing that should stay with you. Go back to Sergeant Curtis Cullen, the man whose steel cutters opened the hedgerows. When the credit came and the story began to travel, Cullen did not keep it. Bradley recorded afterward that Cullen told him the original suggestion had come from another man in the unit, a soldier whose name never made it into the histories at all. He did not have to say that. Nobody would have checked. The device already carried his name. That is not a hero being modest for the cameras. That is a man from an ordinary place refusing to take something that was not his. In an army where an idea from the bottom of the ranks could be spoken out loud, and a sergeant could pick it up and carry it to a general. So, was the German officer in 1919 wrong when he called them a mob? He saw slouching men, officers who did not stand apart, privates arguing with sergeants, and he wrote it down as indiscipline because his tradition had no other word for it. He was looking at the right thing and reading it backwards. It was not indiscipline. It was a different kind of discipline to the purpose instead of to the order. Men who understood what the mission was for, and who therefore did not need to be told twice, and who could not be talked into wasting themselves for nothing. But do not make it a fairy tale. That system did not save the men in the Hurtgen forest, where 33,000 Americans were fed into 50 square miles of pine woods, while the men on the grounds said over and over that it was not worth it. The channel only works if someone at the top is listening. At Kasserine, no one was, and the army learned. At Guettar, someone was. In Normandy, someone was. In Hurtgen, no one was, and the price came due in full. That is the honest version. The American way of war did not make better soldiers than the Germans. Man for man, it probably did not. It made faster learners. It corrected mistakes in 17 days instead of never. It let a lieutenant who had landed with nothing but a knife take a gun battery without orders. and an idea from the bottom of the ranks reach a 3-star general in under 2 weeks. 16 million men went into that uniform from hardware stores and machine shops and farms, and they never stopped arguing, and it drove their officers half mad, and it was the reason. Curtis Cullen came home from the Hurton with one leg. He went back to ordinary work. He died in 1963. There is no monument. Richards went back to Pennsylvania. And the man who said first in a room where the remark should have died is not in the record at all. They were not a mob. They were free men who had spent their whole lives being allowed to say when something was wrong. And when it mattered most, they said it. And then they went and did what needed doing without waiting to be told.